Beachy Head is one of the longest poems I'm asking you to read this term, so I think it's worth taking a deeper look into it, uh, especially since it helps to illustrate the concepts that we've been looking at with Edmund Burke. As we've seen with Charlotte Smith, she very much ties into the romantic reconception of poetry, even though she comes a little bit before what I'm calling the Romantic period. But in other respects, she remains something of a throwback to the 18th century when she published most of her work. Beachy Head is her final poem, published early in the 19th century, and it remains unfinished. There's no telling whether she would have added more to it or arranged the poem differently. The version that we have was compiled by her publisher. So I want to start by considering the way in which Smith employs the Burkean ideas that I've introduced in the previous video. We can see that in line 1. She invokes the stupendous summit, rock sublime. Beachy Head being a high cliff in England. So one of our first questions should be, is this a sublime poem? Does it conjure up the sense of wonder at the unknown that we've talked about with Burke? Or, conversely, does it try to make the unknown knowable, something that would be kind of anti-sublime? At the beginning of the poem, the speaker adopts the position of the observer of the picturesque landscape by fancifully selecting an ideal position from which to view everything that goes on around her. This in itself is significant. This position is conventionally a place of power, and one that is typically associated with masculinity. It was generally a male privilege to be able to go wherever one wants and to seek out natural beauty. Women were at this time more typically limited in terms of where they could go with propriety. So think about the kind of persona that Smith creates in this poem. What are the traits and qualities that you would attribute to the speaker? Is this a conventionally feminine figure, or does she assume more stereotypically masculine traits? To some extent, we can see how all of Smith's strategies seem to be designed to appropriate a certain amount of power. Number 1, she adopts this commanding position atop Beachy Head, a position that, as I've said, implies a sense of mastery over nature. 2, she imagines and projects her own conceptions of history upon the scene. She is imaginative and creative. If we look at line 117 on, contemplation here, high on her throne of rock, aloof may sit, and bid recording memory unfold, her scroll voluminous bid her retrace. This personification of contemplation conflates the poet with this aloof and objective historical perspective, which again assumes a space of traditionally masculine power. And number 3, notice how she supplements her fanciful musings with authoritative footnotes that offer a publicly acceptable discourse to frame her more private reflections. Note that most of the footnotes in your edition are actually Smith's footnotes. They're not the editors of your anthology. So she's not just writing a poem, she's also explaining it at the same time. Again, this use of footnotes also appropriates a masculine power, as historical and scientific knowledge were, again, traditionally masculine domains. And not only that, but in the footnotes, she actually disputes with masculine authorities like Linnaeus and Shakespeare. To a certain extent, then, she appropriates the masculine powers of the sublime and the picturesque and the discourses of science and history. But to a certain extent, she also uses them to undermine one another. The bulk of the footnotes seem designed to shore up the authority of the poem, to kind of tell us, I know what I'm talking about. I know these particular types of plant and animal and so on. But this also seems to call attention to the divide between private reflection and public discourse. So, in many ways, the poem does come off as being sort of anti-sublime. It doesn't allow readers to be simply awed by the unknowable power of nature, but it kind of undercuts that feeling of power through its obsession with objective fact. Moreover, at the same time, she retains a conventionally feminine propriety that claims not to be intruding on traditionally masculine territory. If we go back to the beginning, look at the use of the conditional would. I would recline in line 4. I would mark in line 12. So she's writing about an authoritative position, but only as something that she would adopt if she could. Notice also how she invokes fancy, which is less of a claim to authority. She strangely fantasizes being on the summit of the rock and then imagining the history and so on of the place. Only once she adopts this imaginary place, then she imagines the history of it. So she's kind of doubly displaced from the vision of the poem. Not only does she imagine being on Beachy Head, she imagines what she would imagine if she were there. So again, we see the distance of the speaker from the place of the poem. And finally, despite her appropriation of this position, there is a remarkable lack of personal pronouns in the poem. She goes for hundreds of lines without using the word I once. And when she does use it, it's in order to garner sympathy for her plight. All the way down to line 282. I once was happy while yet a child. I learned to love these upland solitudes, and so on. So here again, she's foregrounding her role as a disenfranchised woman as opposed to an authoritative observer. She does, however, gradually assume an increasingly authoritative stance. Notice how in line 29, she shifts to the present tense. The high meridian of the day is past. While she's been imagining being there, she's now asserting with somewhat more confidence that she is there. The imagination has become a reality. Later, she asserts the visionary and sublime power of fancy. Thither aspiring fancy fondly soars, wandering sublime through visionary veils. And she starts to more authoritatively state her possession of this power. So just to conclude then, I'd like to think about some of the ideological implications of this poem. What is at stake in all of this positioning that I've been talking about? For example, line 55, these are the toys of nature, and her sport of little estimate in reason's eye, and they who reason with abhorrence see man for such gauds and baubles violate the sacred freedom of his fellow man. So here she's talking about the injustices of the world, the exploitation of human beings for the sake of wealth. So again, the point here is that this is not simply a neutral description of nature, but Smith is identifying what is at stake in the this discourse around nature. Similarly, line 167, from even the proudest role by glory filled, how gladly the reflecting mind returns to simple scenes of peace and industry. These lines suggest an anti-militaristic strain. Smith was, in general terms, in favor of the French Revolution, and therefore was opposed to English militarism against France. Even as in this poem she performs the necessary praise of England as a patriotic duty. But here, notice how she shifts from this description of militarism towards saying how gladly the reflecting mind returns to simple scenes of peace and industry. That while we may think of war as glorious, we're much happier talking about peace. But at the same time, England is not idealized. It's not another Arcadia, pastoral ideal, scenes all unlike the poet's fabling dreams describing Arcady. So throughout the poem, she challenges riches and the aristocracy and praises the simple virtue of common folk. He knows not how frequently the child of luxury, enjoying nothing, flies from place to place in chase of pleasure that eludes his grasp. Talking about the fruitlessness of wealth and aristocracy. So again, these may seem like neutral descriptions in some places, but these are in fact quite radical sentiments that indicate her ideological sympathies. She also adopts a very Wordsworthian language in recalling her childhood and her ties with nature as the happiest of memories, as we've just seen. So she identifies herself with this new Wordsworthian discourse that has just been emerging, and she also identifies how poetry, science, and ambition all pale in comparison with these humble virtues. Hills so early loved, in fancy still I breathe your pure keen air, and still behold those widely spreading views, mocking alike the poet and the painter's utmost art. So the inadequacy of art to describe the scenery. Very vain is science's proudest boast, and but a little light its flame yet lends to its most ardent votaries. And finally, hither ambition, come and behold the nothingness of all, and so on. So in all of these cases, the promise of knowledge is challenged by its inadequacy in comparison to the simple virtues. The poem then ends with the description of the stranger and his songs, and I would encourage you to think about why the poem ends in this way with the hermit.